For breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Good evening, all you lovely people, and welcome along to Neil Oliver Live. I am Neil Oliver and I am live on GB News TV and on radio. Tonight, the BRICS summit has taken place this week in South Africa, and we ask, is there a new sheriff in town to challenge the G7? We'll be brought up to speed on the latest developments by leading figures from politics and business in South Africa. Following the death of the Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, we will look at whether this destabilises anything out there and what it means for President Putin. Plus, we discuss India having the huge achievement of landing on the moon's south pole, an area thought to be important for minerals and fresh water, and many nations are eyeing it as a site for future mining. Have India taken a lead on space exploration? All of that and more coming up, but first an update on the latest news from Tatiana Sanchez.
Neil, thank you very much and good evening. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. Some breaking news to start with. Tory MP Nadine Dorries has resigned her Commons seat, accusing the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of demeaning his office by opening the gates to whip up a public frenzy against her. Well, in her resignation letter, Dorries accused Mr Sunak of abandoning the fundamental principles of conservatism. He also said that history will not judge you kindly. More on that breaking story in the next hour. Most of Spain's coaching staff has resigned following conduct of Luis Rubiales at last weekend's Women's World Cup final. Rubiales is currently suspended by the FIFA from all football-related activities as he's accused of grabbing star player Jenny Hermoso's head and kissing her on the lips following Spain's victory at the World Cup. He said it was a spontaneous and consensual little peck and said false feminists were trying to kill him. A statement from the coaches has said he offered a story that doesn't reflect in any way the feelings of Jenny, who stated she felt the victim of aggression. The RMT union says a roadmap to a negotiated settlement could bring an end to an ongoing dispute over jobs, pay and conditions. Today's train strikes, continuing for a second year, comes as many people head off on summer holidays or travel to events such as the Notting Hill Carnival. Assistant General Secretary of the RMT union, Eddie Dempsey, says the government's modernisation plans are not in the interest of passengers.
What we're seeing now is the centrepiece of the government's modernisation plans, which we've been warning about for a long time, is the closure of every ticket office in the country and the de-staffing of the railway, dehumanisation of the railway. And their plans around this are not to improve things for the passengers, are not because we've all suddenly become networked and modern and don't need to interact with other humans. This is purely about ensuring profits for the private companies that have got a stake in our railways now continue to flow. And we think this is just one part of what we regard as the managed decline of Britain.
4 young people were killed in a road crash in Clonmel Island last night as they were on their way to celebrate their exam results. They've been named as Zoe Coffey, Nicole Murphy and Grace McSweeney, all aged 18, and Luke McSweeney, aged 24. Local sporting events, the Clonmel Pride Parade and other activities have all been cancelled as the community mourns. The deputy head of the British Museum stepping aside while a police investigation into stolen artefacts is underway. The museum's head, Hartwig Fischer, resigned yesterday and an unnamed member of staff has been sacked. It's understood that the items, which include gold jewellery and semi-precious stones, were taken over a significant period of time. Former Chancellor George Osborne, who's now the museum's chairman, says some of the items have already been recovered. He's promised an independent review to look into how the museum missed the warning signs. The seaside town of Dawlish in Devon has been named as the best place in the UK for a summer holiday. GB News' South West reporter Jeff Moody is there to tell us why.
Well, yes, it's August Bank Holiday weekend, and according to TripAdvisor, 80% of us are heading out on a bit of a staycation. And according to Visit Britain, 4 million people are headed down to the West Country. And where are they headed to? Well, Dawlish, down here on the south coast of Devon, is proving to be the most popular place in Britain for this bank holiday weekend. And they certainly need the trade. It's been a lousy summer in terms of weather, and that has really affected the tourist trade, where people have been spending a lot less while they go out. They've not been eating in restaurants. They've not been going on day trips as much as normal. And the outlook for September and October certainly doesn't look particularly healthy. The weather looks like it's deteriorating. The Met Office is saying there's no sign of a heat wave coming or an Indian summer. So really, this weekend is the weekend when all of the businesses down here in places like Dawlish need to make the most of the weather, need to make the most of the tourists, because it's not looking great moving forwards.
Right, and finally, monster hunters have spent the day searching Scotland's most famous lake for the elusive Loch Ness Monster. These pictures are coming to us live from Loch Ness, where it's looking like a grey and cloudy day. Researchers are gathering there to carry out what's believed to be the biggest surface water survey in more than 50 years. They're using equipment that's never been tried on the Loch Ness before, such as drones with thermal imaging, as they try to spot any strange anomalies. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying Play GB News. Now it's back to Neil.
I'm seriously thinking the West might be going down, like a gunslinger grown old and careless, or a prizefighter past his prime and living on past glories. It happens to the best, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, with the arrival of a new sheriff in town, or a contender with the core strength to soak up the punishment until yesterday's man uses up his old moves, exhausting himself in the process. George Foreman was the undisputed world heavyweight boxing champion until he faced Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle in a stadium in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo in the October of 1974. Ali leant on the ropes, absorbing Foreman's ineffectual punches until the champ was spent and ripe for the fall that came in the 8th. An Ali left hook brought Foreman's head up into position for a straight right to the face. None of the commentators saw it coming, talking all the time about the imminent threat of a one-punch knockout from the champ. As Foreman pirouetted loosely to the canvas, Ali hovered above, right hand cocked but elegantly withheld, the punch not thrown because the former champ was done anyway. There might be an omen in remembering a hitherto undefeated, undisputed heavyweight falling to the canvas under an African sky. Australian journalist John Pilger has written recently about how propaganda has propped up America, furnishing a reputation as the good guy, while all the while the truth was that that erstwhile paragon of virtue has been a common or garden bully. So much of what has happened over the decades, always in the name of the West, has been spun and manipulated by propaganda. In a piece entitled Silencing the Lambs, Pilger pointed out that 9 of the top 10 media companies is based in the USA, along with the social media heavyweights. While the US, the West and NATO have gone about their business, those media companies have held their coats. Pilger records how over the course of his lifetime the US has, quote, overthrown or attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments around the world, most of them democracies, interfered in democratic elections in 30 countries, dropped bombs on the people of 30 countries, most of them poor and defenceless. It has attempted to murder the leaders of 50 countries. It has fought to suppress liberation movements in 20 countries, end quote. Pilger's testimony reads less like the career of a hero fighter and more like the rap sheet of a gangster. I have loved the thought of America all my life, watched the movies, listened to the music. I still love the idea of America, of a land of free people pursuing happiness. America's full of good people, just as Britain is full of good people, just as the world is populated in the main by good people who just want peace, peace with their neighbours so they can get about the decent, honourable business of raising families. Make no mistake, life in the West has been a wonder for hundreds of millions of people, a world in which things work, of people mostly entitled to equality before the law, a world mostly of tolerance and plenty. No wonder other millions want to come. The people of the West are not the problem. People like you and people like me, as US musician Oliver Anthony sings in his protest song that speaks for the world. The problem has been generations of increasingly corrupt leaders and their corporate masters bent on profit and dominance for themselves and their own. But the world is going through a time of change. We feel it. During a time of change, anything might happen, including good things. In seeking to have it all for themselves and to deny the plenty to the many, the corrupt few have inadvertently unleashed something they can't control, which is the determination of millions to defend the lives they have had. In pushing for change that suits themselves, the few have exposed their true natures, and we see them. He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind, as it says in the good book. I wonder more and more if the old champ still has it in the legs. I watch the West, watch our latest clumsy moves, and wonder if we've grown punchy and vulnerable. The West still has it in the lips, if not in the hips, still up for forever fights like the one in Ukraine. That tussle was meant to bring Russia to her knees. Instead, it exposes corruption and hypocrisy. We've seen, too, an alliance forged between Russia and China that has in turn emboldened so many others. This week, a host of nations gathered in Johannesburg in South Africa for the latest BRICS summit. The BRICS countries have been Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Now 6 more, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are invited to join in January. Chinese Premier Xi Jinping said the expansion of BRICS would further strengthen the force for world peace and development. Fancy that, Xi of China owning the source of peace for the world. Vladimir Putin addressed the conference via video link and said the neoliberalism of the West was a danger to traditional values in developing countries. Who would have seen that coming? The day when the West was lectured by Vladimir Putin about the importance of traditional values, the West being accused of posing the greatest threat to those values. No one predicts BRICS will supersede the West just yet, not today and not tomorrow, but more and more of the world's enormous producers of energy are seated or hovering around the BRICS table. What happens next? Those countries with 40% of the world's population trading among themselves, not in the US dollar, but in their own currencies, or one alternative currency, backed by their own bank. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa told the delegates BRICS already accounted for a quarter of the global economy, a fifth of global trade. He said Africa was a source of the minerals of the world's technological future, rich in lithium, uranium, vanadium, cobalt, platinum, palladium, nickel, copper, rhodium. It's not just in economic and military terms that the West, NATO, looks increasingly exhausted, across which is spreading the shadow of an unwritten tomorrow. Those craven coat holders of the media, the newspapers, the rest of the mainstream dinosaurs, even the erstwhile totalitarian control wielded by the new social media titans, looks outmanoeuvred, played at their own game. US journalist Tucker Carlson hosted Donald Trump in front of an online audience numbering in the tens of millions, at least, if not the hundreds of millions. Podcaster Joe Rogan routinely commands an audience the relic media can only dream of. All over the online world, fresh contenders are on the move. From here in the UK, Russell Brand speaks to millions. The BBC and the rest are reeling from blows they never saw coming. The world is on the cusp of change. What happens to the West, to the world, if the collective called BRICS emerges in time as an alternative G7 or G20? What happens if the West continues to demonise oil and gas while the BRICS nations wallow in the wealth of the huge percentage they control? The unique selling point of the West used to be the observance of the rule of law, due process. The rest of the world no longer sees the West that way. Jailing political opponents like banana republics is in the playbook of the West. The silencing of journalists who challenge authority and authoritarianism, Julian Assange among them, is in the playbook of the West. Capitalism, an imperfect system but arguably the least worst, that has lifted more people out of poverty and towards prosperity than any other, is warped by a handful of Western oligarchs so that they and only they make money, unimaginable amounts of money. Those oligarchs seek to force neo-colonialism on the wider world, in African countries among others, while pushing for neo-feudalism at home. You'll own nothing and be happy. As a consequence, money, wealth that used to flow towards banks in London, Paris, in the US, might stay where it's made, in Asia, in India, in Africa, in the Middle East. The rise of BRICS is the rise of proof that the rest of the world increasingly finds it has better things to do with its wealth and therefore its influence. Voices our leaders don't want to hear predict the emergence of a multipolar world where the word of the West matters less. Addressing the conference in Joburg, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said the dynamism of the world's economy was in the global south and that BRICS was its driving force. He said Africa, predicted to be the world's most populous continent by 2100, was building a free trade zone of 54 countries. Empires rise and fall, champions come and go, overtaken by time and hubris. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that it's not what people say that matters, but what they do. Talk can be cheap and the ripe stink of corruption is everywhere. But right now, some of the best lines are coming not from the West, but from elsewhere. Lula of Brazil told representatives of his fellow BRICS nations that in just a few years we have left behind a scenario of benign multipolarity towards one that resumes the obsolete mentality of the Cold War and geopolitical competition. He said, an increasing number of countries, among them the BRICS countries, are engaged in making direct contact with Moscow and Kiev in pursuit of peace for Ukraine. He said BRICS nations can't remain indifferent to the deaths and destruction that increase every day, and that many other conflicts and crises do not receive due attention, even though they cause vast suffering to their populations. Haitians, Yemenis, Syrians, Libyans, Sudanese and Palestinians all deserve to live in peace. He said it's unacceptable that global military spending in a single year exceeds $2 trillion, while FAO tells us that 735 million people go hungry every day in the world. He said the search for peace is a collective duty and an imperative for fair and sustainable development. Here's the thing. Who knows what comes next for the West, where we have lived, where there has been so much decent aspiration by so many decent people. Let's hope there's a way forward for the West. But aspiration towards prosperity is the right of all. Surely, at the very least, we all deserve to live in peace. The title of Champion of the World is up for grabs. My guest this evening is Molly Kingsley, who's a familiar face on this channel and on this show. Molly, what do you think is the influence of the West on the wane?
Well, I think you look at the influence and you also can look at the moral authority of the West. So in terms, maybe it's helpful to look at it in terms of democracy and also demography. So if you look at it in terms of the population of the West, as a general rule, we have ageing populations, very high dependency rates. I think you use the word exhausted. I think that's a good word. I think if you just look at the UK, we're out of ideas, we're out of innovation. I know we'll be talking a bit about India's moon landing later, and you know, what a contrast to the kind of tired education systems of much.
What about that moral authority, though? That sense that we've been trained to think that the West are the goodies, the men in white hats.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think particularly after the last few years, many of us, even in the West, would see that as the illusion it is, and no doubt always has been. And actually, you mentioned a very interesting article that I believe Pilger wrote about this. And actually, within that, there's a really interesting quote, I think, from Harold Pinter, who's a playwright. Let me just read this out, because in accepting the Nobel Prize for Literature, he said, "The crimes of the United States have been systematic, constant, vicious, remorseless, but very few people have actually talked about them. You have to hand it to America. It has exercised a cynical manipulation of power worldwide while masquerading as a force for universal good." And I just thought that was such an interesting quote, and it really speaks to, I think, the loss of influence of the countries that held themselves out as these shining moral lights.
Thank you for that, Molly. I've got to get to a break. Up next, though, after the break, is a new bloc emerging to rival the G7 and the West. The BRICS summit has been going on in South Africa, and we'll have two guests who can give their verdict about the expansion. Don't go anywhere.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Monday to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello there, welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. I don't think I'm alone in detecting complacency in the West regarding influence in the wider world. We indulge ourselves in thinking that because the West has called the shots for decades, that it will continue to do so. The truth is much of the rest of the world has other plans in the form of an alliance going by the acronym of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, with everything to play for. My guest this evening is politician Mmusi Maimane. Mmusi, are you there?
Good evening, and thank you so much for having me, Neil.
No, Mmusi, this is a story that I think has not received the attention that it deserves here in the West. Is the West paying enough attention, and how important is this confederacy, this union of nations?
It's significant, and I think, as you have reflected correctly, that it represents 40% of global trade. As you know, Africa itself is heading towards a population dividend where in 2024, 1.2 billion people will live in the continent. As you can appreciate that Africa and the many respective countries that you speak about, Brazil, Russia, China, are now starting to think hard about how to create a multipolar universe. And therefore, naturally, I think this is a significant step in terms of what the BRICS summit has concluded. The inclusion of further countries has become Argentina, the UAE and many others represents a step, and applications have also increased. So it tells you that the world is rethinking, or at least the global, the geopolitics are reshifting, and suddenly people are starting to think about maybe it's about time that countries take their destiny into their own hands. It doesn't dismiss the point that the West still has a significant role. I know, speaking as a South African, there's still much of a significant role, but I think it's a recognition of the fact that there's a significant opportunity to reset, if you like, global order.
What are the priorities of the BRICS nations? Because it is quite an eclectic, culturally and historically diverse group of nations. What will they come together to seek to achieve?
Yeah, I think I want to answer the question twofold. The first and most crucial one is obviously intra-trade amongst those countries. Secondly, there's a strong conversation about de-dollarization, so not only placing trade amongst those respective countries on the basis of the dollar, that they could use currencies that are common to those countries. That's going to be crucial. Thirdly, I think, and this is the other point I'd like to make, many of us can recall the COVID period and how that COVID period had profound implications in the distribution of vaccines, as an example. So one of the key difficulties was that I know as a South African how difficult it was to watch when the South African scientific community discovered a variant of Omicron, and suddenly the global West, as it were, countries like the UK, etc., started shutting borders to South African tourists, whereas the case numbers were low. I must say that spoke of a West that is patronizing, that doesn't necessarily treat fellow member countries with equal respect. And that started to develop also over a history of time an attitude that says, well, these countries must cooperate on developing their own pharmacology. They must begin to develop their way in which global security is now dealt with, and also how to strengthen their ability to engage with bodies like the United Nations, the UN Security Council. So I think you are starting to find a block that's starting to go, actually, our destiny can't be in anyone else's hands. We've got to take it into our own hands. We've got to chart our way forward and begin to negotiate strongly collectively.
Thank you. Mamusi, I have a guest in the studio as well who I want to involve in this conversation. Molly, is it just me, or do you feel that there's been a conceit in the UK, in the West, but not really registering what's happening in the rest of the world? All these disparate countries coming together with a shared sense of self.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the conversation about COVID and the Western reaction to COVID as a catalyst for some of these attitudes is really interesting because, you know, certainly from watching it here, it is no surprise at all that the period of really extreme moral cowardice and lack of leadership that we saw from many Western states, including the UK, the period of extreme vaccine nationalism, and really, in some cases, you know, is tyranny too strong a word, actually, to describe what happened? It absolutely shocked, I think, many of us here. So it comes as no surprise. And in some ways, actually, I think it is potentially a positive thing to hear other countries empowering themselves and actually saying, well, we've had enough of being preached to and lectured by a West that can't sort its own house out.
I think too, Mamusi, the idea, a word that I heard repeated by various speakers at the conference was multipolarity. And I think my instinctive reaction to multipolarity is that it's a good thing to have many voices rather than one.
Certainly. And I think certainly for the purposes of Africa, the idea of multipolarity is vital, because Africa in certain instances has suffered from the very point that I think you'd made earlier, the extraction of resources, the beneficiation of those resources, and for them to be sold back into Africa in a much more increased value, that many African states have found themselves with minerals, yet in very poor. This is not only a function of blaming the West. Of course, we've had some leadership difficulties. We've got other issues like that. But I do think now there's a reckoning that says, how do we beneficiate our own goods? If we've got minerals that sit within us, how do we do that and create another superpower block so that we're not being dictated to by the pace? And the issue of dictating has many implications. You know, it has how we do ratings and capital flows of countries. When we think about economic transitions, especially in issues such as the greening economy, that has a new implication for what African states have to deal with, considering that their composition and their state of development is vastly different from many of the countries in the EU. So I think it requires maturity, it requires mutual respect. It also requires that this is not a period to which you are creating an enemy of one, but creating a new polar to which we can then begin to treat each other with some sense of respect.
Now, South Africa hosted the event. The African continent is of huge significance to the world in all manner of ways. What was the atmosphere at the conference? How was that received there?
Yeah, I think if you it was a really important gathering. It was important that it was on the African continent. I think there's a genuine sense of there's a newfound respect amongst peers, but also a new interest that's coming forward. I also think that it also gave an opportunity to send a strong message of strength, given the number of heads of states that are coming through. We often have reports about G7, G20. It was a really great new initiative to see these countries gather together. It also gathers against the context of a significant conflict taking place in Russia, Ukraine. And I think the sense of that position being taken by countries to say that issue needs to be resolved peacefully is going to be important. It was not without the controversy of Vladimir Putin. And I think for many progressive South Africans and Africans, certainly think that we should remain part of the Rome Statutes and ensure that those are upheld. So BRICS in themselves and member states are not universal on this issue. But if there's a condemnation of Russia, there ought to be a condemnation of other conflicts that are taking place in the world without the hypocrisy. And so I think there's a sense of angst that says, well, are we going to look at some of the conflicts that have taken place in Afghanistan and many other places? So I think these developments are going to be crucial, maybe not in the immediate, but it will matter in the next 10, 20 or a few decades to come as what happens with this bloc.
Mamusi Maimani, thank you so much. Always fascinating to hear valuable insights that give a different perspective, on topics that have been, talked to death in another direction in our part of the world. So thank you, Mamusi Maimani. Yevgeny Prigozhin spent almost a decade building the Wagner military group. Now his reported death has sparked a flurry of speculation about the group's future and whether the group could become more dangerous. Academic Frank Furedi joins us to discuss this shortly, but first, a look at the weather.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. I hope you weren't caught out by some of the showers that we've had around today, certainly some heavy and thundery ones, and there's a chance still of seeing a few thunderstorms to start off this evening, but for many central eastern areas they will be easing their way off as we head into the night, though persisting for western England, Wales and some drizzly showers for parts of northern Scotland where it is going to remain relatively cloudy. Slightly cool night, towns and cities dropping down to 10, 12 degrees Celsius, but into single figures for some rural areas as we start off Sunday morning. Generally, the further east you are, the best of the sunshine you'll have first thing, bar the odd mist and fog patch early doors, but they'll all readily clear their way off. The showers in the west, though, will start to trundle eastwards as we head into the afternoon, generally persisting across the spine of the country into the afternoon. Again, some of those could be heavy. Some more persistent cloud and rain pushing into Northern Ireland later on, and that will hold temperatures back a touch around 15, 17 degrees Celsius. As we head into Monday, though, this area of high pressure in the Atlantic is going to gradually push its way into the UK, and that will help settle things down a touch. There is still going to be a little legacy of cloud, particularly for parts of central England into the day, so might be a bit of a grey one here, but either side of that, some sunny spells developing, a few showers around at times, but generally fewer compared to Saturday and Sunday, and so generally fine for those of us lucky to have the bank holiday Monday off. Further sunny spells and scattered showers as we head throughout the rest of the week as well. Bye-bye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. Now, speculation surrounds the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, chief of the Wagner mercenary group that's been so instrumental in Russia's efforts in Ukraine and elsewhere. Prigozhin died along with at least 9 other people when the private plane in which they were travelling from Moscow to St. Petersburg was brought down by a bomb hidden on board. The Wagner chief led a revolt. Some have called it a protest over relations with the Russian Ministry of Defence in June. Joining me now to wonder about it all is academic and commentator Frank Furedi. Hello, Frank. Thank you for joining me.
Pleasure.
It's endlessly interesting, I'm sure. What would you say we are to make of what has happened this week past?
Well, I think that he had to go because, as far as Putin was concerned, what Prigozhin did with his mutiny was to expose the fragility of the oligarchy's position. I think people often think that Putin and the people around him are very powerful. They're totally in control. But although they are very authoritarian and they got a lot of resources, they're much more fragile than we often suspect. They're not really in control of this huge Russian Federation that they are meant to be governing. And what happened, in a sense, was that what Prigozhin did was to demonstrate that a large section of the Russian security forces are not very happy with the conduct of the war, not very happy with the government, and they're quite prepared to support somebody who's prepared to defy what has been happening so far. And that exposure really meant that Putin had to kind of clamp down sooner or later. Otherwise, his position would become even more fragile, because what he's really worried about is that other people are going to emulate what Prigozhin did, and other people are going to try it on as well.
You say that, but the action taken was all over by tea time, effectively. You know, you say that the Putin and people around him, that it was fragile, but when that unfolded, it was brought to a close very quickly, which looked like something that was controlled.
It was brought to a close, but in the meantime, they shot down a helicopter. A lot of the security forces that were meant to be protecting the big capital city refused to fight the Wagner Group. It was very evident that the local population was either indifferent to what was happening or were actually quite supportive. So in many ways, I think that Prigozhin made his point. He demonstrated that he's got a lot of clout. And I think in many respects, it was him that brought it to a close, rather than the fact that the conflict was brought to a standstill. And So we don't know actually what would have happened if they had carried on, but there was still a long way to go. A lot of potential for creating even more problems had they decided to carry on with the mutiny.
Frank, bear with me while I bring into the conversation my guest in the studio, Molly Kingsley. Molly, what did you make of the timing? You know, yes, we could all see that there might have been there were ways in which Putin might have wanted to be rid of Prigozhin, but why do it in that way at this time?
Honestly, I don't know. I think the thing that struck me actually is why bring down so many people? So there's the timing and there's fact, you know, there were also civilians on that flight. And actually, you know, as we were chatting about just off air, like you would have thought if you wanted to take out 1 or 2, 3 people, you could do that without killing innocent people. But, you know, ultimately this is one war criminal kills another war criminal, probably, maybe.
What about that, Frank? You know, what about that? And also, why would someone like Prigozhin, who might have been feeling vulnerable, why was he flying over Russian airspace at all?
Well, he's a very arrogant and very defiant individual. A few days before his demise, he was producing a video, was telling the world that he's back in play, that his troops, the Wagner troops, are going to free Africa. He was asking for more recruits. He was asking Russian oligarchs to invest in his different businesses. So he felt very, very confident. I don't know why, but he felt really, really confident that he will be able to carry on because of the fact that he had all these mercenaries behind him. And I think that's the reason why he felt quite at ease going back and forth between Russia. He's been there before, after the coup. He went there about 4 or 5 weeks after the coup to meet some African leaders. And that was very surprising because nobody imagined that, you know, having been exiled, his exile, you know, was only 3 or 4 weeks long before he returned to Russia. So, yeah.
As we touched on earlier, though, the timing, you know, Putin was there to be a star turn at BRICS. So why do it now, and why do it in a way that, you know, brings down so many other people? You know, if someone like Putin wanted Prigozhin gone, you know, it could have been done much more cleanly without collateral harm. Why opt for this tactic?
Well, I think from Putin's point of view, there was Prigozhin on the plane. There was the guy who's the main financier, who's in charge of the money side of the Wagner Group. There were several key security players there who played a very important role in the tactical and the logistics side of the Wagner operation. So, in a sense, he got rid of 4 people that were, as far as he was concerned, quite dangerous. And the fact that a few other people died in the process is really not a big issue for someone like Putin. He's not exactly an individual who's understands the quality of mercy.
Frank Ferreri, it's at the very least a story that will continue to fascinate me for the time being. I think there are many more questions than answers available. Thank you for your insight, though, this evening. We're on another break, after which we look at how India has become the first country to successfully land a spacecraft at the moon's South Pole. Don't go away.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Put your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. This week, India became just the 4th nation on Earth to successfully land a spacecraft on the moon, and I will freely admit that took me by surprise. The Vikram lander touched down on Wednesday evening near the south pole of the moon, and the following day, a rover vehicle took a walk on the lunar surface. Joining me now to contemplate the significance of it all is astronomer and science writer Dr. David Whitehouse. Good evening, David.
Hello.
This is a big deal, a much bigger deal than I would have thought.
It's the real start of the return to the moon, because the south pole of the moon is going to be where everybody's going to be focused. There are going to be more craft landing there. There's going to be a human landing there in a few years' time. And it'll be the place where, in a decade or so time, we have a moon base. So for India to become the first nation to actually land in that area and get the ground truth of what it's like, make the first measurements, they must be delighted.
What is the significant? They're clearly significant where they landed on the moon. What is the big deal with the South Pole?
Well, the South Pole, as the North Pole, but the South Pole is preferred, is a region of dark shadows. If you're standing on the South Pole, the Earth would be in one position and it would go through a series of phases. The sun would walk around the horizon and the shadows would move around like the hands of a clock. Wow. But the sun would stay very low, so the shadows would be very long. There would be huge swathes of the surface where the sun never reaches. And it's in that eternal darkness where it's thought there could be ice. There could be shards of ice, and that's important because with ice you've got water, you've got oxygen to drink, irrigate, and also oxygen and hydrogen are rocket fuel. So it's a valuable resource for when you go and settle there.
So it's a filling station
further out. It's a filling station.
Well, it's almost magical, isn't it? You know, the way David's describing, you know, the eternal shadow and the darkness.
It is magical, and I think it's especially so because obviously this was done on a relative shoestring. So, you know, I think the budget for this landing was less than the movie Interstellar, less than the movie Gravity. And actually, I read a great article about it earlier that said in the early days of the Indian Space Research Organisation, scientists would transport parts of the rockets around on bicycles. And for me, I just think, wow, that is such an amazing, creative vision. And it's a kind of creativity and energy that we seem to have lost a bit in this country.
Well, India actually has been very clever in the sense that its first space program was very utilitarian. It was designed to understand the land, the weather, the minerals, the drainage, the crop health. It was all for its own benefit, and it's evolved into wanting to explore further and develop this side of its industry and its technology.
It's been asked before, but it's probably worth asking again. Why has it taken so long to get back to the moon, given that people were there in person in the 60s?
And last person to walk on the moon was 1972. There are only 4 moonwalkers alive at the moment. America tried to go back to the moon lots of times, but they never really gave it a full effort, in the sense that they started a project and then they gave it a lot of money, and then Congress came and sliced a bit of the money, so the timetable extended, and then they took more money away from it, and it took longer, and eventually it died. And that's happened several times because there was no urgency to beat the Russians, as it was in the 1960s.
Molly, do you think, in these straitened times for so many nations and so many individuals, you talk about it being, fairly low cost, should we be investing the kind of money to go to the moon and then further out? Is it valid?
It's very inspirational, isn't it? Inspirational and aspirational. And actually we can, debate till the cows come home what we should spend money on. I think what we shouldn't be doing is wasting money. So spending money for a valid cause, fantastic. Wasting, for example, 15 billion, I think it was, on, COVID, PPE and vaccines and tests that weren't used, not so cool. So it's about better use and allocation of resource.
We were talking earlier about BRICS and that coming together of many nations. Why can't the nations come together to get to the moon? To bring together all of that expertise and all that wealth.
It would be nice, but there's big politics here.
There's always politics.
China wants to become the major space superpower of this century. Things are changing. And as it gets wealthier, it spends more on space. There's a crude Chinese space station in orbit at the moment. So they want to see themselves in a few decades the number one. America is worried about that. India it sees itself more allied with China in developing its program with them. So things are changing. Russia is a declining space power now. It's hard to see how they're going to get over these recent setbacks. So the geopolitics is changing. But one amazing thing I thought about China and America is that China goes big on space in the way America did when it was going to the moon, but it does it now. And there was a survey of teenagers in China and in California. Same question, same demographic. What do you want to do as a career? The teenagers in America said YouTube influencers. The Chinese said astronaut, which sums up the future, I think.
That says something very significant, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It sums up China's desire and ambition, because you could argue that they don't have to go back for a mandate. They don't have to vote for this. The government has decided it's going to do it.
How would you say, philosophically, has China inculcated that in its youth, and America has not? Why would the Chinese kids say what you'd want them to say, which is something like, to the stars?
Well, it's stopped them having access to TikTok, for one thing, hasn't it?
It's a very interesting, the way that China is using. They've learned from the space race. They're using the culture of space. For India and for China, if you don't have a space program with people, you're not really part of the big league of nations. On one hand, it's a flag you fly to say we are big and important. On the other hand, it does fertilize and improve the economy. But China has grasped the image from the Soviet Union, the Americas, of progress, of being leaders, of heroes. The astronauts in China are heroes in a way that astronauts are not in Europe or in the United States. They have space cities. It's remarkable,
India,
really.
having done what it's done, do they steal a jump on getting to the moon, or is it still much more likely that it be China than anyone else?
I think it's going to be America. In a couple of years' time, they're going to land. Next year, a crew of 4 are going to go round the moon. And a year or two after that, there'll be a crew of 2 landing on the moon. The first black person and the first woman will become the 13th person on the moon. And so you're going to see, after that, possibly yearly landings on the moon, staying for longer. But by the end of this decade, China will probably land on the moon. The head of NASA, Bill Nelson, testified in front of Congress recently, and he held up a map of the South Pole of the moon, and he said, I'm worried if China gets there first or establishes dominance, they'll stop us from going. So there is conflict and worry about the future.
There's always conflict. Thank you, David. That was wonderful. I love hearing about that kind of aspiration. That's all we have time for this evening. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We'll be back at the same time next week. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, David. Up next is the amazing Emma Webb standing in for Father Calvin Robinson.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. I hope you weren't caught out by some of the showers that we've had around today, certainly some heavy and thundery ones, and there's a chance still of seeing a few thunderstorms to start off this evening, but for many central eastern areas they will be easing their way off as we head into the night, though persisting for western England, Wales and some drizzly showers for parts of northern Scotland where it is going to remain relatively cloudy. Slightly cool night, towns and cities dropping down to 10, 12 degrees Celsius, but into single figures for some rural areas as we start off Sunday morning. Generally, the further east you are, the best of the sunshine you'll have first thing, bar the odd mist and fog patch early doors, but they'll all readily clear their way off. The showers in the west, though, will start to trundle eastwards as we head into the afternoon, generally persisting across the spine of the country into the afternoon. Again, some of those could be heavy. Some more persistent cloud and rain pushing into Northern Ireland later on, and that will hold temperatures back a touch around 15, 17 degrees Celsius. As we head into Monday, though, this area of high pressure in the Atlantic is going to gradually push its way into the UK, and that will help settle things down a touch. There is still going to be a little legacy of cloud, particularly for parts of central England into the day, so might be a bit of a grey one here, but either side of that, some sunny spells develop